Well, welcome everybody to our second of a summer full of Summer with the Bible, Summer Bible School. And I am so glad that you have joined us this morning, and we have some exciting things ahead of us. Last week, as you may recall, we talked about the Bible overall, how many books there are, and all those little details there. We talked about translations. And I'm going to move right into sharing this screen. And so you can all see it, hopefully. And I always feel so good about that we can all see the screen together. And I had a few thoughts from last week. We talked a lot about, just all the issues with translations and the Bible and overview. And you saw Hebrew Bible and all the problems with trying to translate it with all those little squiggles and so forth. And then we go a few thoughts from last week. Specifically about the King James Bible, published in 1611. We always have to be careful, and I mentioned this last week, but I want to make sure it was verified, that whoever's translating the Bible probably has some kind of bias. We all do. And so if you have a choice between words, or you have a choice to leave out a word or put one in, you probably are more apt to do that along with your own understanding of what you think the Bible should say. And this is what I found online, just one of the articles about this. And the reason why he liked this new translation was he despised the popular Geneva Bible. That was brought up last week. Were there Bibles before King James? Yes, there were. And Geneva Bible was one of the most popular. And it bothered him because it was sometimes borderline revolutionary marginal notes. He was more concerned about it being too revolutionary than the quality of the translation. And so, and then that bottom paragraph, just consider how preposterous it was to have a team of elite scholars writing for a largely illiterate public, and amazing achievement. But the mandate was, as it says here, ludicrous because it called for a product commissioned to reinforce a clear-cut royal political agenda, to be done by elite scholarly committees, and so forth and so on. You can read the rest of it here. I'm just trying to get that as a foundation for what we do. We all have our biases, and we have to live with it. That's what the Bible is all about, through the eyes of people and through the ears of people, through the years. That's why this Bible can still be talked about, 2,000 years later, 3,000 years after some of these stories were written. So with all that said, any other thoughts about that as we leave last week and move to this week? Any other comments on that? I can only see 6 of you or 5 of you. So if you raise your hand, just simply also say something. Move forward a couple times. You saw what we did last week, and that's what we had this time. And then we move on. So here's what I'm going to talk about as we enter. Oops, let me just try to get, okay. We're going to talk about the rest of the 3 weeks here. Today, we're going to talk about the first 2, dates and historical settings, just to make sure we're understanding the kind of the flow of the years here and that we know of for sure. And then look at 4 persons who had the most impact on shaping the scriptures: Moses, David, Elijah, and Jesus. Moses, the patriarchs representing that, David, the king, Elijah, the prophets, and then Jesus, a gathering of all of them. And then the next 3 weeks, next 2 weeks, we will look at the next 3 areas: social movements, how these compositions may have been written, just a little bit of that, and then get a sense of theology and so forth. So that's our schedule, and let's just move forward then and into it. Important dates. The first date we might want to look at is 1325 BCE. That's when the Exodus from Egypt under Moses took place. We know some of these dates only because we know some of the who was the Pharaoh at the time and so forth. It goes on to 1000 BC. It was really nice of them to make it 1000 so we could easily remember that for David's kingdom. We'll talk about David in a few minutes. Somebody else. And then it only lasted 75 years, as you see. It broke into Northern Kingdom, Israel, and Southern Kingdom, Judah, 925. It only lasted 2 centuries then, the Northern Kingdom by itself. And so Assyria comes in, one of those empires we talked about last week, and took over the Northern Kingdom, Israel. And then there are more empires. The next one was with Nebuchadnezzar in 586, the destruction of Jerusalem and with Babylon, and then the exile of Judah into Babylon. You know, there was some other deportations around that time. And then Persia becomes paramount for the empires, and Cyrus was the one who freed them, and they went back to Jerusalem. That's what we're talking about in our scriptures this month for our worship services in Ezra. And so we have that, all that background going on. Notice in this one slide, we have the empires of Egypt. And you could say that Israel was an empire then. It was powerful in 1000 BCE. Assyria then, Babylon then, and then Persia. Imagine, you know, what they had to deal with and where these stories come from. But we move further. The Greeks come in and take over the Persian Empire, yet another empire. And that's when we start to have the Hellenization of the world, and the Greek language becomes paramount. And then there's revolts in 167 BCE, before the Common Era, against all of this. And then Rome takes over, the seventh empire to take over in 63 BCE. And then we move forward, and 29 AD or so, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. 70 AD, destruction of Jerusalem by Roman armies under Titus. And then a final revolt in 135 AD by Bar Kokhba. And that was the end of the Jewish hopes to return to power. And Rome now had it to themselves without a whole lot of opposition, apparently. So that's a whirlwind historical survey of the Bible. Are there any questions? And you just have to simply, I can only see one person. So if you could just speak out if you have any thoughts about that. There are more dates in there, and we'll come across them, but these are some of the assured dates. Okay, all right. Well, let's just see where this takes us. Well, it takes us right to Moses, the covenant maker. And so these are the first of the 4, as my dad would say, pioneering persons in his manuscript, Gateway to God's Word, which I'm basing, my 4 weeks on, just so you know. It was never published. It was a manuscript that I was given back in '84. He did a video series as well out of the University of Akron. I was part of some of those video series. I looked a little younger then. I remember recalling about 30 years ago when I saw these things. For the last time, I think I haven't looked at them since. I don't have a VCR anymore, so I don't know how that works now. And this is the first of the pioneering persons. And just one note, as you look at this photograph of Charlton Heston being Moses, a lot of people think of Moses as Charlton Heston only because of the movie by Cecil B. DeMille. And one word about the things he's holding there, the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are a pretty big deal these days, and they are often in small towns across the country. You'll see a monument with the 10 Commandments on it. You say, wow, look at this. This is amazing. The Bible got out into the community that way, and these little towns, have had it ever since. The only issue is there's a background to that. Most of those, if not all of them, come from trying to promote this movie. The 10 Commandments, they went all across the country, all these actors, and they had these monuments, and they built them, and they drummed up support for this movie back in the 50s. And so we have this whole thing about the 10 Commandments. It's a little skewed, maybe not as much anymore, maybe it is. It's still skewed by a production, Cecil B. DeMille, back in the 50s of Charlton Heston, as if the Ten Commandments are the sole thing that we think of when we think of how we are supposed to live our life in light of the Bible. So anyway, just a few words about him. And quickly, just tell him, just get it out. Anyone can just talk. Tell me what you know about Moses. Anything that comes to mind, just share.
Little baby in the river.
Mm-hmm.
Rushes.
Mm-hmm.
Killed an Egyptian.
Yep.
Burning bush.
Mm-hmm.
Not being allowed into the promised land.
Okay. He was a slave.
Yeah.
Parting of the Red Sea.
Yes, good.
And he murdered in person, didn't he, while he was as
Right.
a younger man, as a slave, right?
Right. Right. Well, you are all good. We can just skip Moses now. It's amazing that we know so much about Moses, and we should. You know, as someone said, as Jesus is the center of the New Testament, Moses would probably be the counterpart in the Old Testament. He has such an influence on what we think about as we think about who God is. And he, well, we'll go through some of the stories then and just kind of reiterate what you had just talked about. You know, he lived around 1300 BCE during the time when the people of Israel were enslaved in Egypt. They traced their lineage back to Jacob, and you know the old Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob fame. And they came to Egypt during a time of famine, some generations earlier. Born in the time of Ramses, famous pharaoh. Moses' father and mother were from the house of Levi. And very important point here, the Israelite population was increasing so rapidly that the Pharaoh had ordered all male Israelite babies to be exterminated. And so they were worried back then that there weren't enough Egyptians as opposed to other foreigners, so to say. And so Ramses took it into his own hands, and imagine that. It was a ruthless world back then. So the mother, as we just mentioned, one of the great stories, you know, that you probably learned when you were real small, many of us did, placed Moses as an infant in a papyrus basket, sealed it tight, hid him among the reeds by the bank of the Nile, and rescued by an Egyptian princess who reared him in the court of Pharaoh himself. What a story. What a great story. And let's see what else we have here. Oh, okay, we start with one of the great stories, Exodus 3, 1 through 15. And I remember when I was back at Ghost Ranch years ago, I took a storytelling course, and this was one of the stories we had to tell. And so it was really, every time I see this story in Exodus 3, I'm always thinking back to Ghost Ranch and how much fun it was to tell this story and not just to read it. And so can anyone just, without looking at it, besides it says Shutterstock, that's all I can find at the moment for a photograph of Moses, not a photograph, there's no photograph, a picture of the burning bush as some person's rendition of it. Can anyone just tell the story at all? Anyone have the story in mind well enough? Because back in Ghost Ranch, I did not have the story well in mind. It just never popped up in my past there. So anyone have a story, want to tell that story?
Can't remember how it starts.
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. Why don't we go to it then? Keeping flock, father-in-law Jethro, beyond the wilderness. Now that's really cool. Just to think there's something beyond the wilderness. He came to the mountain of God. This one is named Horeb. It's named different places, Sinai and so forth. Angel comes to him in a flame of fire. He looks, bush blazing, not consumed. And so what happens, you know, if you think something's sacred, you know, something strange is happening. How many of us have thought about instances in our life when something strange happened and we thought right away that maybe it was something more than just the ordinary. Maybe there's something sacred going on. And so because of that, he says, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why this bush is not burned up. And then God calls out, Moses, Moses, here I am. What a great phrase we hear often across the Bible. And then the sacredness comes in. Come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. It reminds me of a quick story. Back in Ohio, we had a beautiful church called Church of the Covenant right downtown, right down in the district where the hospitals are and the museums are, and a tall pulpit. And we had the moderator of the Presbyterian church at the time speak to us at a Presbyterian meeting, and she removed her shoes before she walked up the 10 steps or so to that high pulpit, saying, this is holy ground. I need to remove my shoes. And that comes from, this kind of an understanding of God and us. And so God says further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We know that earlier, as I said last slide, that he's from that group of tribes. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. That was one of the prohibitions. You can't see the face of God. If you do, you die. That's one of the things you read in the Old Testament. And God is too holy. And then God says, I've seen what's going on, and I want to deliver the Egyptians, bring them out into a good and broad land, and to the country of Canaanites and Hittites and Amorites and so forth. God acknowledges there were people there already. It's not just the land flowing with milk and honey. And the cry of the Israelites has come to me, and I will send you to Pharaoh to bring the people out of Egypt. Yow. And as might be expected, Moses was not too keen on the idea. If I come to the Israelites, he needs to know your name. The names are so important back then, especially. I mean, if you knew the person's name, you knew who they were, you knew what they were all about, perhaps where they came from, and what you could expect from them. And so naturally, if you had the nerve, you would ask somebody their name. Moses apparently had the nerve to even ask, what God's name is, and God says the famous, I am who I am. It could be translated, I will be who I will be. You can't capture God in that name. You can't pin God down and say, this is who God is and nothing else. God left it all open. And so I am has sent me to you. And so you see the rest of the story. Anything there that you did not remember at all? And sometimes we forget, what these stories are all about, and we need to have a few things filled in. And as a bishop of Sweden said one time, Christer Stendahl, he said, the things that you don't remember may be the most important in the story. And so it's always fun to ask if people can tell the story as a group. Often do that in Bible study on Fridays. And then we find out by reading it, what did we leave out? And that may be something we need to focus on that day. So anyway, any thoughts about that story? It's one of the paramount stories of all the scripture, finding out who God is. And I am who I am. You can't capture God. We'll never know all about who God is. God is sacred. Remove your sandals. Okay.
Harry, I like the remove your sandals part. I like the ambiguity of I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. But what strikes me this morning that I had not remembered is with Anne's question. How does the story begin? And here we have Moses just out tending his father-in-law's flock. It's just kind of doing his own thing. Is not really minding his own business, but minding his own job. And out of his, what, could have happened any day of the week, I suppose. And then all of a sudden there's the burning bush experience. I'm struck by that this morning.
Yeah, and that gives the rest of us pause, I think, and a little bit of hope, saying, maybe in my ordinary day as well, something may happen. Or if I look closely enough at things I often see and take for granted, maybe I'm seeing more things than that I've missed that I need to really focus on. So yeah, wonderful insight, Bill. Thank you for that. Yeah, we're part of these stories in many ways. What does that mean for us? This story mean for us? Yeah. Anyone else?
Harry, I'm aware that this is one of the many instances in the Old Testament when God intervenes in the history of humankind and, in fact, makes some changes, is moved by what he sees, and therefore changes his mind.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of carries over into present day where people are praying for rain. I don't see in the New Testament parallels to this. I don't see that God in the New Testament appears and seems to be moved by people's problems. If God were, we have plenty of problems today. So I'm simply pointing out that this is, to me, an Old Testament phenomena, which I don't see carried over into the New.
Right. Not in the same way, certainly, as we would in the Old Testament. Someone said one time, and wrote a book about it even, where God seems to become more quiet and more silent as the stories go on in the Bible. And that God was pretty well present early on, and people had a real sense of God being there. He shows up in a bush, and God walks among the trees at night in the breeze, and in Genesis, and all these stories. And then as you go farther and farther, you don't see God as much in the stories, and you don't hear God as much. And I would say that in the New Testament, Jesus becomes the spokesperson, for God then. Through Jesus, we see what God is doing in the world. So yeah, it's a great insight, Bob. It really is. It's kind of frustrating as well. But what it tells me is that when we say, why doesn't God do something about this? Or why, if we ever heard those phrases, what all this violence, all this, all these issues with immigration or whatever you want to bring up. Well, if you look at the story, God does do something about it. God sends Moses. God does do something about it. Maybe God is sending us, sending somebody. And so we have to get that in mind. Don't wait. Maybe because God's already said, Moses, and then the story goes on. So anyway, fascinating insights from just one story. Anything
Harry, I
else?
was also wondering, I really believe, or starting to really believe a lot about that, the evolution of, the Bible story covers so much time, and it's written by men under the inspiration of God, but still men who are culturally in the whatever world they're in. And it seems like to me, as man began to evolve, his thinking was not more anti-God, but they didn't see God as the only thing that was going on whenever anything big would happen. And then, of course, like you say, when you get to Jesus, it kind of spreads out more. And then he leaves the Holy Spirit for the apostles. And I'm just wondering, how much of this is just the fact that in the time this was written, people were more inclined to make God the direct cause of something because they had fewer other places to go. Mm-hmm. Not to deny the burning bush or the Ten Commandments, I'm not saying that, but that they saw the world in a more primitive way. I don't know. I'd love to get somebody else's opinion on that.
Yeah. Any thoughts about that? Because that certainly makes sense to me. Our culture does not lift up these kind of sacred stories in the same way presently. I don't hear any sacred stories being told about God's presence with us now in these same ways, that we don't look at the world that way. as much. Any thoughts about what Alan was saying? Anybody? Well, good insight, Alan. Yes. I'm going to move on then. And to another story real quick. The let my people go part of it. You know, we were in chapter 3 before, and then it took all the way to chapter 6 to get some more of the story. And the Lord says to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. And indeed, by my mighty hand, he will let them go. By a mighty hand, he will drive them out of his land. And so God spoke to Moses, said to him, I am the Lord, and so forth and so on. He's always trying to place himself, God's self, to make sure that Moses knows who Moses is talking to. And it's a real formula, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all the time. And there's this covenant to give them the land of Canaan. There is just reiterating some of the things we've heard before. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, with mighty acts of judgment. Okay, let's just move on and see what this story tells us, really. And I would take you as my people, and I would be your God. One of the first covenants, this Mosaic covenant. I will be your God if you will be my people. And that was huge back then. This idea of the covenant. Let's just move on. And then go and tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites go out of his land. And so forth and so on. The story continues with this whole idea of deliverance and to free them. So, these stories, this story was told over and over again in Israelite circles. And as the years passed, there was an increasing tendency to stress the miraculous aspect of it. But it does not need to be given always that. We all know the stories of the plague. We can't remember all the plagues, but there are a lot of them, like 10, or 9, 10, right? And plagues of frogs and gnats and flies are common occurrences in the Nile Delta. Hail, locusts, and darkness are natural phenomena that recur with regularity in the region. And of course, the one you've probably heard before as well, the Red Sea may be the Sea of Reeds, real shallow, marshy waters. And that when the wind blows, like we had wind yesterday, when the wind blows, it often blows back the water and you can walk across it. That's been one of those theories and one of those natural phenomenons that people have talked about for years. So there's always ways to begin to try to bring it into our world. I've seen a frog, been bothered by gnats and flies, and I know what hail looks like. I know locusts right now, we certainly do. In darkness, of course, we have the whole eclipse phenomena. So we can imagine some things happening, and you start to think maybe that's all because God wants the people to be let go. And then the Sea of Reeds kind of fills that out. Any thoughts about those kind of ideas? Well, there you go. Last one then. The covenant on Mount Sinai. There it is, Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. Depends who's writing the story. And there it is. That's pretty forbidding mountain. And I can imagine that stories would crop up around there, and that if we saw lightning and heard thunder, that would be pretty amazing and put us in a whole different realm, Mount Sinai. And so we know the 10 Commandments. We saw it on Charlton Heston's tablets in the beginning. A photograph. It was a photograph. Don't get Charlton Heston mixed up with Moses. They're two different people, everybody, just so you know. And so I won't read through all of this. We know the 10 Commandments, maybe not in order, but we know more or less what they're all about. This was one way then that the people at that time could figure out how best to live with one another. These are very important to keep the tribe together, to keep them safe, and to keep the community going so there wasn't too much disruption if people do something wrong. They have it all laid out before them. Follow this and we should get along okay, and we should probably survive. And Bill, Humphrey, we talked last week about that translation where it said, let's see, well, did I go past it already? Wait, no, maybe, one second. Okay.
Looks like verse 6.
Adultery, right?
Oh, there it is. Yeah, 14. Yeah.
That was early on, a mistranslation early on. This is not just a contemporary mistranslation. So just so you know, that was really interesting. I never heard that before, to be honest with you. And so people can really mess things up if they miss a word. And that was another example last time about that. Any thoughts about the 10 Commandments? I'm always mindful of time. We only got through Moses.
Well, one thing that strikes me, Harry, is the beginning of that. We often miss the first part. I think it was verse 2 in the earlier slide, where God speaks first, and the whole event of the 10 Commandments is in response to God first being God who brought us out of the land of Egypt. And I regret that I was fairly well along in my age before I, heard that connection or even saw that connection in the early verses there.
Nice. The idea behind that is God always speaks first. That we respond, and that God is God, right? And so, yeah, great insight. Love it.
Yeah, and our response then is one of gratitude, not like punishment or parental direction. It's out of gratitude that we do these following 10 things.
Mm-hmm. Are we ready to move on, everybody? Let's just see if I miss. Okay.
Basically, God was talking to us about, I will be their God and they shall be my people. This is God stating, I will be your God, and basically being my people means acting like this, being this kind of people, people who follow these commandments, and in that way you'll be my people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
This
in
is the kind of
fact,
people I want.
and in fact, that's it's so huge for our understanding of our relationship with God and the covenant that God did, and that's maybe the most important occurrence that day, because that's called a suzerainty treaty, a sovereign treaty. Back in those days, it's been uncovered by and understood by scholars. It goes way back, but this covenant that God made with Israel. And here Moses took a form of organization of the political life at his time and applied it to the relationship between God and God's people. These treaties were the means by which the reigning king reached out to bring smaller and weaker nations under his control and protection. And within the exception of the acts of Jesus himself, it is the most important contribution ever made in the history of religions to describe the dealings God has with humankind. And so Moses, in this story, was taking what was already present with kings and subjects and with smaller nations, weaker nations, and applied that to who God was and their relationship then with God. It's pretty fascinating. I won't go into all the details of it, but again, how these stories, it may just seem to be God doing all this and it's all new and so forth, but they were dealing with these issues as well. And this put a framework around how they were going to look at their life together and how they looked at the sovereignty of God, the sovereignty of a king. They liken the same in some ways with this treaty. And as Margaret said, how important this treaty was, this understanding, this covenant was. and it kept the people going for a very long time. We'll find out, though, when we get to David in a few seconds, actually, that it starts to break down some with David. But remember that treaty, remember that covenant.
Harry, it just occurred to me that, we have Moses with this, miraculous rescue, and he's taken to the court of the Pharaoh. And then we don't hear anything more, like with Jesus, until he is called to his leadership position. But you wonder what he observed in Pharaoh's court, the politics of everything as he's absorbing all this. And was it a different Pharaoh when he goes back to ask for the Israelites to be freed? I assume it was, but
to be honest, I'm not sure. Ramses was around a very long time, but we don't know how old Moses was. The scriptures always obscure the ages because they have people in their hundreds because they were looked at as being such a major figure, and so they grow in age. But we know people that live that long. So I'm not, to be honest, I only knew of Ramses, but maybe there was a change in pharaohs, but I'm not sure about that. But the idea behind a pharaoh is probably, the only one who has power is the pharaoh. Whatever the pharaoh says goes, and that was probably the major point we need to remember. They were ruthless, and it's amazing these stories that we got Moses into that pharaoh's court, and like you said, what in the world did he learn, and what did he learn not to ever want to do again? Yeah, great point there.
and at least in the story, he never says, "Oh, remember me," or calls on that connection if there was still something there.
That's a great point. Yeah, he doesn't use it for his own advantage there. And he was so distraught over what was going on under Pharaoh's leadership that when somebody killed a slave or mistreated them, he killed him. He was so upset over that. You never know if it was just raging in him to see all the injustices being done, and he's part of that court. He's part of that family. So remarkable in the beginning that Moses would actually remember his roots, even though he's just an infant. I never knew his mom really can remember his mom, probably. And to grow up that way, but still to have it instilled in him, the justice.
Well, actually, his mother was his nurse.
Well, I said that, I was just thinking.
His sister was waiting in the reeds, and she saw. So she came forward, and Pharaoh's daughters went, "Oh, look, this poor little baby. We should get a nurse for him." And Miriam says, "Oh, I know somebody."
Oh, yeah. There you go. Thank you for reminding me of that. And so maybe there's a lot more instruction being done by his nurse, his mom, than what it says. And so, yeah.
But yeah, if he grew up in Pharaoh's court, there would be things he would learn.
Yeah.
But I don't think he would. Since if there was still a murder rap out for him, I somehow don't think he would say to Pharaoh, "Oh, remember me."
Maybe not. But it strikes me the women play an important role in this story of making sure he's safe and taken care of.
No, exactly right. And we talked last week about how it was such a patriarchal society back then, and how amazing it was that women come through all the time. And for these patriarchal people writing this often, I would imagine these are stories that the women play such a pivotal role, a majestic role in that. So yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out again. Women come through once again. It's a theme throughout the Bible. Well, I'm gonna, if I could, just move on to get another person in here. We'll probably just not get through with David in our time together, and we'll continue next week, but we'll start with David and see what happens. What do we know about David?
A man after God's own heart.
What was that, Alan? Sorry, what was that?
A man after God's own heart.
Okay, all right. What else?
Sling.
Yeah, sling, right?
and Goliath.
Goliath, right?
You got that version of thou shalt commit adultery.
Good point. Nice, nicely put there, Joy. Anything else? As you see here in this painting, he's a musician, known to be a musician. Let's see what I have here to help along. Okay,
Friends with Jonathan.
he was a statue. A lot of people know him as a statue. And okay, that's how well, and Alan's a just and God-fearing king, as Alan referred to, alluded to. Came from the tribe of Judah, town of Bethlehem. We know all of that through this Jesus story, city of David. Much of his early life shrouded in legend. Youngest of 8 sons of Jesse, and by all accounts, a person with great charm and ability. And stories of his early life sound like similar ones that grew up around those of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. You know, these are great stories, are they not? And the name David, really fascinating. No Israelite before this man had carried it, and as far as we know, none afterward. It may at first been not a proper name, but a title which meant leader or chief. And that's, if I can. And then just a little parentheses here. So far, we've talked about Hebrews enslaved in Egypt, and then we have Israelites, and then we have Jews. It's just good to stop, just make sure we're clear on these terms. They all have different meanings. Israel, the most sweeping name with a political connotation, 12 tribes, kingdom of David and Solomon, northern kingdom, general term for the people as a whole, or some portion of them. Now, Hebrew is a sociological reference, and there are different ways to spell it, and the history goes back centuries. Anywhere in the ancient world, they were outcasts, those in debt, slaves, former slaves, those disappointed with the ruling government, and those at odds with the establishment. So they were a particular group of people that we look upon and say, wow, they're kind of on the outside of things, or they're on the edges, kind of causing some trouble for this establishment when they can. So Hebrew has that sense to them. So no doubt about it, when they were in Egypt, they were an outcast group. Their children were being killed by Pharaoh. They weren't wanted. They were used only as slaves, only as chattel, just to rev up the economic engine there. And so that's the Hebrews, and that's the group of people where all of this comes from. All of us come from. And then Jew, religious meaning, contraction of the name of the people of Judah, and described those in exile in Babylon who recast their faith and retained their religious identity. So I just want to get that in there, just so we understand the 3 different terms that we're using. Any questions about those 3 terms? Does that clarify anything at all? Okay, well, there you have it. Let's see if we get back to David, just for our few minutes left here. He began as a Hebrew chieftain, so that's where he came from. You know, the outcasts, the ones that were causing some problems for the establishment. And he was head of a band of Hebrews. And he survived these, as it says, ghastly wars between the Philistines and the Israelites. Military man, outstanding ability. After the death of kings, oh, there's so many stories here. Just read scripture about this, 1 Kings. After the death of King Saul, he consolidates power and becomes ruler over both Judah and Israel. Captured the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites and made it the city of David, the political and religious center of his expanding kingdom. And this is always so intriguing to me. Lying on the spine of a mountain, Jerusalem measured only 1,300 by 325 feet. Now, I mean, oh, come on now. That's hardly anything. Had been in existence for 1,000 years. This city of David, Jerusalem, the city shining on a hill, was only measured that much at that time. So that was kind of fascinating. Our home seemed bigger than that at times. Maybe not all of us, but. And then he inherited a long tradition of justice in Israel. We have Moses and the patriarchs to thank for that. And that's all called by the name of Torah. You know, the first 5 books of the Bible. Involves case law and legal precedent. And as we've had the 10 Commandments with Moses, they're summed up in those 10 Commandments. And, you know, there wasn't much room in these cities, especially in Jerusalem, as I just said, 1,300 by 325, that the elders could only find space to gather at the gate. And anyone who had a grievance would come and present his or her case. And the king's role in all of that was not judicial, but just administrative. It would see that justice was done. And maybe I'll do one more slide. And that was done, that was the way it was in the early part of his reign. But his later reign, the process began to break down. The machinery that he had to administer justice was just not comprehensive enough to meet the new demands placed upon it. Torah was designed for another time, for a local village and clan, and now David was governing that huge kingdom, and it had never been envisioned by the designers of Torah, and so it was breaking down, and it failed because David could not work out the technical problems of developing a system that justice could then be delivered. But the main reason justice wavered was that, and here's getting back to what I mentioned before with Moses, that covenant. David began to move away from the covenant made by Moses that bound the people to God. Instead of the people were promising to organize their lives in ways that reflected their direct accountability to God, here God promised to protect the kingdom. And God's promise was so binding that not even wrongdoing on the part of the monarch would cause God to break this promise. And so God was bound to protect the kingdom, but the kingdom was not bound to be faithful to God. And this was a giant step toward the basic heresy of the pagan nations at the time, uniting throne and culture. So, any thoughts about that, which we probably have to end on? We'll resume David next week, along with focus in on Jesus. Elijah and then Jesus. But any thoughts about the justice and David and so forth? We kind of went through this quickly enough. We can resume it next week. But any final thoughts? It's always good to have people stunned by the end of a class. I just think it's so cool. You can't even speak. That's really what I'm shooting for. But these are just some ideas to put out there. We can talk more about what that means for us today, that uniting throne and altar, or what that might mean for us today in our politics, about breaking that covenant. It was a covenant that had been with them, for a couple hundred years, and now David comes, wants power, and breaks that covenant. And then all the problems that happen as a result of that.
I don't think I ever heard what you had on that earlier slide, the meanings of Hebrew and that kind of thing. I don't think I'd ever seen that before.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, only because they're used in different ways at different times. Why do we use Israelite instead of Hebrew? Why do we use Jew instead of Israelite, and so forth? Well, there are different reasons for that, as you see here in this slide. Religious, sociological, and Israel being the sweeping name for it all. And, one definition of Israel, every time you see the word the letters EL at the end of a word, that means God. That's the God that, we would probably adhere to. It's a generic form of God. And Israel might mean let God rule. That's one definition of the word Israel in Hebrew, let God rule. And how far we get away from that, right? So we hope to do that. Not sure what that means. But thanks, Anne, for pointing that out again. It's helpful to me to remember these things as I, read through Scripture and understand what this is all about. Funny, it's called the Hebrew Bible, the Outcast Bible, the Outcast translation. I mean, the Outcast, the words that come from those that language. Pretty
Yeah,
fascinating.
Yeah, the Hebrew is also the name for the language.
Right.
So, that's good, which is interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah.
That the language is called that, and that's obviously one of the reasons why it's called the Hebrew Bible, because it's written in that language originally. But if Hebrew as a word means that the fact that it's also used to describe the language used by these people, and that this people with that name would have a culture unified to have a single language is interesting.
Yeah. I have to play with that one more and get a sense of that. But it's fascinating to me, these words and these stories and these persons. So I really do appreciate you being with us. We'll continue next week. As I said, we'll talk and finish up. Any thoughts about David? We went through that pretty quickly. We'll get to Elijah, kind of, the prophet, and we'll look at a few of the stories there with Elijah and what that prophet is all about, and then get to Jesus. And so a lot of good things ahead, everybody. It looks like Delise is back. And so once she's back, we have to end this one. And Delise will usher us into the next one with a different Zoom link into our 10 o'clock gathering. So I thank you all. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you next week if you can make it. Thanks all. Take care.